We're going to look at colonial slavery and how there was a great deal of variety in the institution of slavery in the South, depending on where you were and what time period you're talking about. Most people get their images of slavery from the 19th century, the couple of decades before the Civil War, um, and they associate it with the cotton economy. And of course, at that time, that was the dominant form of slavery. But in the colonial period, as I think you know by now, cotton wasn't even on the radar screen. It wasn't a significant crop until after the invention of the cotton gin, which happened only in 1793 after the Revolution. So this is a whole other period of slavery. We've discussed tobacco in Virginia. Now we're going to look at the three areas or regions of the United States, or of the colonies, the British colonies, not yet the United States, um, and how they interacted with the institution of slavery. The lower South consisted of South Carolina and Georgia, to some extent North Carolina. That was sort of a border region. Um, it was dependent on rice and indigo, mainly. That's one region. The North consisted of all of these colonies here, north of the Chesapeake, and slavery was much less important there, and it was often concentrated in cities. It often involved household work, servants for wealthy Northerners, some agricultural work, but not all that much. And we've already looked at the Chesapeake. We'll look at a couple different aspects of it here. That would be Virginia and Maryland. And there, of course, it was focused on tobacco. Now, I want to introduce a couple of terms. The term Creole is used in various ways, so I want to define the way it's going to be used here. A Creole is a slave who originally traced his or her ancestry back to Africa, but came via the Caribbean, spent at least some time uh, on an island in the Caribbean, and was influenced by that culture. Very often, Creoles knew English better, were more familiar with English customs. Africans, on the other hand, the way I'm going to use the term is slaves who came directly to mainland North America, to the British colonies, from Africa. So they didn't have that influence of the English language and the English culture that the Creoles got from their time in the Caribbean. Now let's look first at the lower South, and the most important colony to study here is South Carolina. Um, the big dividing line in the history of colonial South Carolina is rice. Just as tobacco was in Virginia, it was rice in South Carolina. Now, before rice, which in that period is from 1670 to around 1700, um, the conditions were very primitive. The first settlers, English settlers, only came to South Carolina in 1670. And it was at a time when they had no large cash crop. They hadn't figured out that rice was going to be a valuable crop there yet. They hadn't cleared the land very much. This was sort of a frontier society with a very small population. Now, they were actually exporting more Native Americans. They were enslaving them and sending them to the Caribbean more than they were importing slaves at the time. Those that they did bring were from the Caribbean, mostly from the colony of Barbados. Carolina was said to be a colony of a colony, the first colony being the small island of Barbados, where sugar was grown, but sugar didn't do very well in Carolina. So they really were still in search of something that would make their economy go. Uh, there was an atmosphere that has sometimes been called sawbuck equality. It's not real equality by a long shot, but slaves would often work alongside of masters, uh, and the name sawbuck equality comes from the image of a saw that takes two people to use it. Um, they would have to work in tandem and cut down trees, clear the land, working together. Now, the process doesn't work unless they're both working equally hard. So if one was a master and one was a slave, then that created a kind of pseudo equality, a false equality, but nevertheless, it brought masters and slaves much closer together. Now, rice changed everything. That would be after 1700, and it grew rapidly over the course of the 18th century. Um, just like Virginia, there was an enormous demand for labor when they discovered how profitable rice could be. So the colony grows rapidly, and the slaves who come to South Carolina after 1700 are mainly from Africa and from certain parts of Africa. The Windward and Rice Coast, and I'll show you a map of that in a minute, and Angola, farther south in Africa, were prized as sources for slaves because the Africans from those areas already knew how to grow rice. Now, if you think of English settlers, they didn't know much about rice. Rice doesn't grow in England. And there is good evidence that the slaves actually were the experts in growing rice, and they applied African techniques to South Carolina. The masters were actually ignorant of the process, and it's the slaves who educated them. Slavery in the rice growing areas, which were along the coast of South Carolina, was much harsher. Uh, the climate was very humid. Disease was rampant, and the process of growing rice requires a tremendous amount of moisture. There were mosquitoes and very high heat and humidity. This was a terrible place to work. The planters, therefore, would often build mansions in Charleston and would go for long periods of time without even visiting their plantations. They would hire overseers and stewards to run the plantation, and they were, unlike the situation with sawbuck equality, they were very distant and very removed from the slaves that they claimed to own. In some areas, there were black majorities. The rice growing process was very labor intensive, and the great majority of it was done by slaves. This is an ad from 1769 for slaves. I want you to notice something about this. Um, it says here that they had just arrived from Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a rice growing area. It's uh, in that part of West Africa where slaves would be uh, prized for their rice growing skills. And the buyers of slaves knew that very well. Here's another ad, and this time it mentions the Windward and Rice Coast, where Sierra Leone is, and other places are where rice was grown. And they assure the buyers that they've kept them free from the least danger of being infected with the smallpox, um, and that they have, you know, kept them on board and separated them, from any contact with the settlers in Charleston, or as it's spelled here, Charlestown. And they note here that half or more of them have had the smallpox in their own country, which means they are now immune to it. This is the area that we're speaking of here, the Windward and Rice Coast of West Africa. Here's Sierra Leone, and this whole area here was prime rice growing country. Now, there were major differences between the Creoles who had been in early South Carolina between 1670 and 1700, and the Africans who were newly arrived directly from West Africa. The Creoles tended to be urban. They would work very often in Charleston. Africans stayed on the plantations. The Creoles did a variety of jobs. The Africans did mostly field work. The Creoles had some geographical mobility. They were often involved in transporting rice, in various types of jobs that required them to be on the move. Africans typically never left the plantation. The Creoles wore English clothing. The Africans in the fields would wear loincloths. The Creoles tended to have a lighter skin color. The Africans were darker. Now, it's pretty obvious the reasons for this. There was sexual abuse of Creoles by white masters, and this was the consequence. The attitudes of the two groups varied a great deal as well. The Creoles wanted to narrow the gap with whites. They wanted to be as close to whites as possible. Sometimes they, even if they were very light-skinned, they could attempt to pass. To pass means to be accepted as white and to move into white society. It was difficult to do, but not unheard of. And they tended to stay clear of Africans. There was a large gap between the two groups. Africans wanted to widen the gap with whites. They wanted to retain as much of their culture as they could, and they wanted nothing to do with their white masters if they could help it. They wanted to grow their own food in their own gardens. They wanted autonomy, self-sufficiency. And they certainly wanted to preserve African culture, to retain what had been torn away from them when they were carried against their will across the Atlantic. So these two groups stayed quite separate, and they didn't really like each other. The Creoles were afraid of being lumped together with Africans, and so they wanted to separate themselves. The Africans were also more likely to revolt. So they were more threatening to whites, and this is a main reason why the Creoles wanted to stay clear of them, because they didn't want to be restricted the way that they knew the Africans were. Now, in coastal South Carolina, especially in areas with a black majority, a system of labor developed called the task system. Now, there were various positions on a plantation. The master was the owner. He would often live in Charleston, and he would go where conditions were better, where he could live in luxury, where the disease was not so rampant. He hired a steward. This was the boss of the plantation while the master was enjoying himself in Charleston. The overseers were below the stewards. They actually managed the labor. Drivers were slaves themselves. They were like foremen in the field. That was the organization of the management of a plantation. Now, field slaves, as opposed to house slaves, but field slaves were assigned tasks as a group. So the entire group, under the direction of a driver and ultimately an overseer, the entire group was told, this is the work that you need to complete by the end of the day. And when they finished their tasks, they were free to work in their own gardens, which is something they very much wanted to do. The benefit to the slaves was that they could work as a community. And this is very different from Virginia, where they were held accountable as individuals. Here, they needed to accomplish their tasks as a group. Now, this was used in areas with black majorities and unhealthy conditions, such as the South Carolina lowlands along the coast. The masters and stewards did this for two reasons. One, they didn't want to spend any more time than they had to in those rice paddies. The conditions were terrible. Um, and secondly, they were afraid of revolts, and they didn't want to have to discipline individual slaves because that increased the possibility of a slave revolt. Now, this split between Creoles and Africans has consequences right down to the present day. The Africans were forbidden from using their own languages, so they developed a kind of hybrid between African language patterns, speech rhythms, and English. Uh, and what we call that is the Gullah language and culture. It's also sometimes called Geechee. They're basically synonyms. Uh, and there are still ties from some residents of South Carolina to the modern day country of Sierra Leone. The president of Sierra Leone, for example, has visited the coast of South Carolina, and there are similarities in their speech. Um, in the PDF version of this, and also posted separately to Moodle, there's a link to a YouTube video in which you can hear a little of the Gullah language, and you'll get a sense of what we're talking about here. It's a cross between English and African languages, and I think you'll find it interesting to hear what it sounds like. Okay, we're going to make this a part two. This concludes part one.